My name's Professor Ed Wild. I'm a Professor of Neurology at the Institute of Neurology and the Associate Director of the Huntington's Disease Centre. I'm also a consultant neurologist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery. So I lead a team of researchers doing studies into Huntington's disease, focusing on clinical research and biomarkers as well as clinical trials. I'm also a member of the Institute of Neurology EDI committee and the faculty EDI committee and the LGBTQ+ steering group at university level, and until recently was one of the members of the LGBT+ implementation group. If I start in the middle, it sounds quite typical for how you make a consultant neurologist and a professor of neurology. So I went to private school and then I went to Cambridge University and I did some medical jobs, did a PhD and ended up enjoying neurology, and so I became a neurologist and became interested in Huntington's disease, and so that's what I do. But I guess before I went to uni, my background is slightly less typical in that I grew up in a single parent family in a tiny village in the northwest. So it was a slightly, it was not a privileged upbringing. So I guess when I went to a private school paid for by the government, I found that I was one of the less well-off children at the school, and so that I was also at the year above where I should have been for age, so I was kind of slightly an outsider. And then gradually, realizing that I was gay at school was also kind of put me in an even more somewhat outside position. So what I learned at school, which I then really kind of stood me in good stead at university, was how you turn a position where you're in a minority into something that can be an asset or something that can be a positive thing. Not necessarily fully successfully, but I guess that was part of my journey. So I was not out at school, and then I went to university thinking that I would come out as gay and see how that went. But then in the first week, in Freshers Week, I was in the bar and I overheard some rugby players talking about how there was a meeting of the LGB society the next day, and one of them said we should go along and see who comes out so that we know who to avoid for the rest of our time. And although in retrospect that was obviously a joke, it had a big impact on me and basically made me decide to remain in the closet for another year. Then when I did come out, I was basically, because I'd had longer to think about it, I kind of was very active about it. I became the LGB rep for the college, and I started writing pieces for the college newsletter. But then I think once I qualified, I had a very kind of head-down approach to my career progression that was, because neurology is hard and you have to see the patients and get the papers and get the grants and so on. So I just sort of obviously had a private life, but then my work life was very separate until the middle of COVID, when eventually I was lucky enough to be promoted to professor. And that was a time for me where, partly because of how weird the world was at that point, and think the tide appeared to be turning in certain unfavorable ways in terms of people's attitude to minoritized and marginalized groups. So that was when I was promoted, and I decided at that point to make a much more active role for myself in EDI in general and LGBTQ+ inclusivity in particular, recognizing that as a cis white man who doesn't have a disability, even though I'm gay, that's, we're in the 21st century and things are very different, thankfully, from how they used to be. Essentially, I decided to try and use my position of relative privilege to help other people who may not be in such a fortunate position within the university. I think neurology and neuroscience is a very good example of a group of intelligent people trying to solve extremely difficult problems. And it stands to reason that in order to solve those problems for the benefit of humanity, we'll do a better job more quickly if we are genuinely open to the smartest people with the best ideas. And if we are either knowingly or accidentally excluding or making it harder for people who have less well-represented characteristics to join that group of people, then we could quite easily be excluding someone with the cure for Huntington's disease or the cure for brain cancer or the cure for multiple sclerosis by virtue of the fact that the colour of their skin was wrong, or somebody didn't feel like they wanted to sit next to someone who uses a wheelchair, or wasn't comfortable sharing a bathroom space with a trans person. Those conscious and unconscious biases are potentially incredibly damaging for the future of science. If these were easy problems, we would have solved them years ago. And if you add up women, trans people, non-binary people, people of colour, gay people, bi people, disabled people, that's not a minority, right? That's a majority of the population. And although you may not be excluding those people absolutely, if you're even slightly encouraging them to think about a different career or letting them know that this space isn't for them, then you may be doing untold harm to the human race. It comes down to bringing your whole self to work, but also inviting the whole potential field of candidates to become involved in the solving of these great problems. I think the first thing is to make sure that you are aware that those situations are happening. In other words, to get yourself acquainted with the kinds of behaviours that might not be obvious. If someone's being overtly racist in the workplace, that's obvious, but that's not how racism has its pernicious effects in the workplace. So, think EDI training, it sounds like an obvious thing to suggest, but there are some people who will be using language regularly with best intentions that actually might be marginalising people in the workplace. When you witness these behaviours, I think the main thing is to not normalise it. So ideally, say something in the moment, even really just to check someone's intentions. When you said this, did you mean that? Did you know that might have an implication that you're not aware of, perhaps? Or if it's a more kind of extreme or less acceptable, or less widely used form of behaviour or words, then perhaps first separate the people involved and speak to the person who's been the victim of this behaviour. For me, as a kind of relatively senior person within the department and in the institute, knowledge of the law is crucial. The law actually offers extremely solid protections for marginalised people of many kinds. It also offers protections that are to do with free speech, and often there's a conflict between those things, and so a knowledge of the legislation and of relevant case law is essential, because these are very often employment disputes, or could lead to employment disputes, which could then be the subject of litigation. And so I think extreme care around asserting what is and isn't legal is necessary. Although obviously in any particular situation it's usually obvious what it means to be a good and caring colleague. And I think that encouraging people to be caring colleagues who understand the validity of other people's experiences is always legal. But beyond that, escalation where it's necessary requires a solid knowledge of the law, and also a knowledge of whom to speak to in the institute and institution who can actually advise in a solid way. Essentially, what my position is on all of these things is, don't let it go. And if we want to assert a progressive workplace, we need a solid basis for doing so. I think my advice to young researchers would be go for it. You know, I was not the kind of kid that at primary school would have been expected to become a professor of neurology. And, you know, when I was a medical student, people would say, oh, neurology is very hard, it's very competitive. I mean, it's competitive because it's super interesting, so lots of people want to do it. And the point about competition is if it's fair, if you try hard and if you're smart enough and apply yourself and a bit lucky, you will succeed. And so whatever potential disadvantages you think you might have, give it a try, see if you like it, see if you are, if it's the kind of career that you can enjoy. The Institute of Neurology and the Faculty of Brain Sciences, I have to say, is fortunately one of the most inclusive in the university, with an extremely strong track record of EDI improvement and very supportive across the spectrum. So, you know, in my career, I've never had a problem with discrimination. It does exist, but I think there are really solid frameworks in place for dealing with it and being supportive. So try not to be deterred by the potential for future marginalization, if that is your concern. And then to whatever extent you can, to whatever extent you're comfortable, join the team that is trying to improve the working environment here in terms of EDI, but also across the spectrum. And, you know, we can work together to make the world a better place.